At approximately $15,000, paramotoring is too expensive for most people who would love to get into it. But the advice that I'm going to get into in this video is seriously some of the greatest advice that I can offer. If my own kids wanted to get into flying, I would tell them to do this exact same thing that I'm about to tell you. And if you're watching this video, it's because you obviously want to fly around this awesome and relatively safe flying machine. Maybe you've always had the dream to fly since you were a kid, and now that you're an adult, you finally got the money to do something about it. Until you saw the price tag and thought to yourself, dang, I ain't got that kind of money. If only it costs a quarter of the price, I can get started on my flying journey right now. You can. Hear me out. It's a bit of a compromise and a bit unconventional, but then again, if something sounded too good to be true, that's probably because it is. So seriously, listen closely, because what this video can do is literally change your life. I have been instructing people how to fly paramotors for a few years now and have learned a lot about how people learn how to fly paramotors. Also, I'm hyper aware of what it was like when I learned how to fly. My entry into the sport was really unconventional, but I am certain that it's what made me into a really good pilot. You see, I couldn't really afford to get into paramotoring when I started to obsess over it, but I did have enough to get the paraglider and a kiting harness. So after talking to dozens of people in the online groups about which paraglider was the perfect one for me and getting dozens of different answers, I bought a new paraglider for about $3,500 and a used kiting harness for about $100. In a future video, I'll share my own thoughts about what I think a perfect paraglider is for somebody starting out. But to sum it up right now, I'll say that it should be beginner rated, in new or like new condition, and sized appropriately based off of your total combined flying weight. So be sure to subscribe to the channel, or don't, because I just spoiled that future video. So that is my suggestion for you to buy a new paraglider now if you can't afford to do the entire setup, and here's why. If you're madly in love with the idea of flying as much as you think you are, it should motivate you to get out there and practice as often as possible. And that is what it is going to take for you to get everything you hope for out of it. Meaning, a lot of people who get into paramotoring find out pretty darn fast that it's a lot more challenging than they had previously thought. Watch this. I'm going to connect the dots. The number one thing that people struggle with is takeoffs. I can hear somebody right now in the comments section getting angry with me because they are one of the odd ones who thought that landings were more challenging. But unquestionably, for the majority of paramotor pilots, takeoffs are what hold them back from fully being able to fall in love with flying. Once my paraglider had arrived, I was so happy. Even though I didn't have a paramotor, I had the most important and challenging, but also fun part about the whole paramotor learning experience. Objectively speaking, the paraglider is more important to master than the paramotor itself. Okay, it's common practice for financially wise people to invest their savings into something like the S&P 500 every month. But let's be honest, we're not that. But it doesn't mean that we can't adopt this very effective strategy to accomplish our own financial goals. I went out and practiced every chance I got. I quickly discovered for myself how hard it is to get the paraglider to do what I wanted it to do, but I had all the time in the world, so my tolerance for failure was much higher because I didn't have the paramotor to compel me to get into the air, where the consequences are much higher. And I wouldn't suggest that practicing with a paraglider is entirely risk-free, because it isn't. If you stuck to safe weather conditions in a safe location to practice, you'd almost certainly avoid getting seriously hurt. I would not go out and practice when the wind's max speed is more than 5 miles per hour. Also, I would only practice no later than 2 hours after the sun rises and no sooner than 2 hours before the sun sets. In other words, don't practice when the sun has been up for more than 2 hours. And finally, give yourself a huge, smooth, flat, grassy field to practice on. There was this one time that I didn't stick to any of the rules that I just specified, and what do they say? I found out. I'd been practicing for a while up until that point. I could consistently inflate the paraglider from both the forward and the reverse inflation starting points. I could kite the glider overhead pretty well, and I could bring the glider back down nice and smoothly. On the Dunning-Kruger effect curve, I was right about here, but I was about to be here. My confidence after experiencing so many new successes was reaching new highs. I convinced myself that I could handle stronger and less predictable winds that the later mornings are known to produce. And to make matters worse, there was a little dirt hill that butted up against the grass field that I had always been practicing at, and I wanted to float down it. Experienced people in aviation know that incidents occur when a series of preventable mistakes are made. Everything that I just said perfectly describes this. The winds were gusting to about 10, the sun at its higher position up in the sky beamed down on the ground and started to create thermals. I was venturing out of the safe zone and into the danger zone. After clipping into my harness and connecting to the paraglider, I grabbed the risers and stepped back to initiate the inflation sequence. The powerful glider surged up overhead and I pulled the brakes down really hard to keep the wing from overshooting. And at that very moment, an invisible thermal snuck up on me. I was plucked up from the earth and stared down at the ground as it moved further and further away. When I was about 50 feet up, the swirling winds crumpled my glider and I began to free fall towards the ground.
Time for a joke.
What's the hardest part about learning how to fly a paramotor? The ground. Now back to the show. I was falling, and there was nothing that I could do. Only by luck did the glider suddenly reinflate when I was a few feet off the ground, but I still hit hard, and before I could disconnect myself, the winds surged again, and this time it pulled me all over the rocky desert terrain. I'd been pulled about 200 feet, hitting every rock and thorny plant along the way until eventually the glider got snagged on a large mesquite tree. Still, the glider powerfully whipped around, but I managed to get unclipped from the glider. A few seconds later, the wind had died down and the combined feeling of being bloodied and bruised and all alone out in the desert was eerie. If this story worries you, then I'll consider it a win, because I'd never want to convince anybody to start their flying journey without encouraging them to make safety their top priority. Had I stuck to safe winds at a safe time in a safe place, that terrifying experience would have been avoided entirely. Needless to say, I never went out in questionable conditions again after that. Over the following month, I continued to practice while I continued to save for the paramotor. And while practicing, I tried a lot of different things, like trying to inflate the paraglider without using my hands, or kiting while sitting down. And sometimes when the conditions were just right, I would sprint forward as fast as I could and get like several feet up in the air until gently floating back down. I'd get pulled along the ground from time to time, but always in a predictable and accepted kind of way, unlike the time that I was dragged through the desert. It's so beneficial to develop a love for kiting your paraglider. When you finally saved up enough to purchase your paramotor, you'll find that your transition from the ground to the air will be comparatively simple. So have fun and be safe. So hit the bell and you'll get notified when I make a video showing you exactly how to practice with your new paraglider. And I respond to all the comments. So if you have a question or a comment, drop it down under. I'll catch you guys in the next one.